Imagine being the CEO of a luxury restaurant chain, going undercover as a regular customer, only to be mocked and disrespected by your own staff. What happens next will leave you speechless, as one woman's response completely changes the fate of the company. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Sophie Daniels, the CEO of a prestigious chain of 5-star hotels, had always prided herself on her company's commitment to exceptional customer service. Her name was synonymous with luxury, and every aspect of the hotels was carefully curated to create a memorable experience for the guests. However, lately, the feedback had been troubling. Several complaints had surfaced, all pointing to the same issue: a noticeable decline in the service, especially from the front desk staff. Despite her status, Sophie was never one to ignore problems. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, so she decided to take matters into her own hands. Dressed as an ordinary guest, she walked into one of her company's flagship hotels. It was her first time stepping into this particular branch without the recognition of her name, and she was determined to see the operations through a guest's eyes. As Sophie approached the front desk, she was greeted by a receptionist who barely looked up from the computer. His tone was curt, almost dismissive, as he asked for her name and reservation number. Sophie, in her casual attire and under the alias of a simple business traveler, wasn't expecting any grand treatment, but what she encountered was far beyond impersonal service. It was indifference, even disdain. The receptionist didn't seem to care whether she was satisfied or not. Sophie's stomach turned. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a bad day for the employee. It felt deeper than that, like the foundation of service she had worked so hard to build had started to crumble from within. She silently observed as the receptionist gave little attention to the guests around her. Some were ignored, others were greeted with a forced smile, and a few even had to wait far too long before being assisted. Sophie could feel her frustration growing, but she pushed it aside, focusing on what she needed to see. Then, her eyes fell on an elderly woman standing at the counter, struggling with the self-check-in kiosk. The woman, unable to figure out the technology, politely asked the receptionist for assistance. Sophie watched as the young man behind the desk rolled his eyes before reluctantly helping her. His voice was cold, his body language irritated. He didn't bother to explain anything or offer further assistance. Sophie's heart sank as she saw the elderly woman's face drop, clearly embarrassed by the interaction. She could hear the receptionist mutter under his breath, "She's taking forever. Just let her figure it out." Sophie's mind raced. This was not the luxury experience she had promised her guests. This wasn't just bad service, it was a violation of everything the brand stood for. Sophie made a silent vow right then to get to the bottom of what was happening in her company. But she didn't react immediately. Sophie decided to stay in the background, continuing to observe the rest of the staff and their interactions with the guests. The more she saw, the more certain she became that the problem wasn't just one rude receptionist, it was something systemic. As she stood near the lobby, she noted the coldness in the air, the disinterest in the employees' faces, the lack of attention to the guests who mattered the most. The employees' attitudes were almost as if they felt entitled to the guests' business, rather than the other way around. Sophie had seen enough. She wasn't sure what was happening to the company, but it was clear something was deeply wrong. She decided to keep watching, to take notes, and to find out just how far this problem went. Sophie stood back, quietly observing the scene unfolding in front of her. The hotel lobby was buzzing with activity, guests checking in, others heading out, the usual hum of a 5-star establishment. But to Sophie, it all felt off. She had been watching the receptionist for some time now, and it was becoming increasingly clear that something wasn't right. The receptionist, a young man in his mid-20s, had greeted Sophie with a coldness that she hadn't expected. She had brushed it off, assuming maybe it was just a one-off, an off day for him. But as she watched him interact with the other guests, her unease grew. There was a noticeable pattern. The elderly guests were treated with barely concealed irritation, while those with expensive luggage, suits, or the right look, received smiles and speedy service. Sophie couldn't help but notice the stark contrast in how the older guests were treated compared to the younger, wealthier patrons. It wasn't just the lack of enthusiasm. It was the way the receptionist seemed to resent them. There was a dismissiveness, a lack of patience that was palpable. As one elderly woman approached the counter, struggling with her suitcase, the receptionist didn't move to assist her. Instead, he glanced up briefly, then back down at his screen, hardly acknowledging her presence. "Do you need help with that, ma'am?" Sophie asked, her voice a quiet offer of kindness that the receptionist had failed to extend. The woman smiled gratefully, but her cheeks flushed in embarrassment. She must have been used to this, Sophie thought. It saddened her to see how common this kind of disregard for certain guests had become. Sophie glanced back at the receptionist, now engaged in a whispered conversation with a colleague. They both looked over at the elderly woman, their expressions clearly judgmental. Sophie caught the word "slow" muttered under the receptionist's breath. It was enough to send a chill through her. Her thoughts were interrupted when she noticed another elderly guest, a man with a cane, approach the desk, asking for assistance with a problem in his room. His voice trembled slightly, perhaps from frustration or age, but the request was simple and should have been easy to handle. The receptionist, however, didn't offer much help. Instead, he sighed dramatically, motioning vaguely toward the waiting area and said, "You'll just have to wait a bit, sir. The maintenance team is busy. Maybe check back later." Sophie's patience had worn thin by now. She couldn't stand seeing this kind of treatment, this kind of disregard for the very people who helped the hotel thrive. As she watched, she saw something that made her stomach turn. A couple walked up, likely in their mid-30s, well-dressed, holding expensive-looking bags. Immediately, the receptionist perked up. His tone shifted, becoming almost too polite. "Welcome to the Ritz. How can I assist you today?" His voice was warm, eager even. Sophie's mind raced as she recognized the disturbing pattern. The more affluent the guest, the more attention they received. The older, less important customers were ignored or patronized. It wasn't just a flaw in one employee, it was a systemic issue. She watched for another moment. Then, without hesitation, she stood up and walked over to the front desk, her heels clicking decisively on the polished marble floor. The receptionist barely glanced up at her, still too absorbed in his conversation with the couple. But Sophie stood there for a moment, taking in everything. She waited until they had finished checking in, then cleared her throat. "Excuse me," Sophie said softly but firmly. "I'd like to speak with you for a moment." The receptionist turned toward her, startled at first, but recognition quickly spread across his face. Sophie didn't give him the chance to say anything before she spoke again. "I've been watching you. I've seen how you treat certain guests," Sophie continued, "and I'm deeply disappointed." His face flushed, and for the first time since she had arrived, he looked uncomfortable. Don't try to explain it away." Sophie interrupted him. "You're supposed to treat all our guests equally, no matter their age or appearance. Do you understand that?" The receptionist swallowed hard but didn't answer right away. "Here's the thing," Sophie went on, her tone cold now. "What you're doing isn't just a mistake or bad attitude. This is about the culture you're creating here. And if this is how you think our guests should be treated, then we need to make some very serious changes. And fast." The young man looked down, and Sophie could tell from his shifting eyes that he knew he had been caught. His guilt was undeniable, but there was no sense of regret. It was as if he didn't understand the weight of what he had done, how much damage it could cause to the reputation of the hotel. Sophie took a deep breath and looked him square in the eyes. "You will apologize to the guests you've dismissed today. And if I see another instance of this behavior, I'll have no choice but to take further action." With that, Sophie turned and walked away, the weight of the decision hanging heavily in the air. She didn't feel satisfied, though. She knew this wasn't enough. This wasn't just about one bad employee. This wasn't even just about bad service. This was about a systemic issue that had been ignored for far too long. Sophie felt the fire of determination flare up inside her. She had seen enough. Sophie was ready to take the next steps, to ensure this would never happen again. It wasn't just about one receptionist, one bad day. It was about changing the culture of the hotel, making sure that every guest, no matter their age, appearance, or spending power, felt equally respected and valued. Sophie knew that she couldn't let this go. She couldn't walk away from this fight. The next morning, Sophie Daniels walked back into her hotel, not as the CEO, but in her finest attire with the CEO tag clearly visible. The moment she entered the front lobby, the air seemed to change. The usual hum of activity was replaced with a quiet buzz as both the front desk staff and guests stared, momentarily confused by the sight of their CEO blending in so seamlessly with the crowd. Sophie felt the shift immediately. As soon as the receptionist saw her, his eyes widened. The nonchalance he had shown the day before vanished. He stood straighter, his posture now stiff and uncertain. Sophie could feel the tension in the air as she made her way to the counter, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The receptionist fumbled with his papers, clearly nervous. He had not expected this visit, especially not under these circumstances. Sophie gave a slight nod as she approached the desk, her expression calm but intense. She could see it in the way the receptionist hesitated. He knew who she was now. It was the same man who had treated her so rudely the day before. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice cracking just a little as he stammered. "Good morning, ma'am. How may I assist you today?" "Good morning," Sophie replied, her tone cool and composed, yet carrying an underlying weight. She didn't need to say much, her presence alone spoke volumes. The man struggled to regain his composure. His usual briskness seemed to have been replaced by awkward politeness. She could almost see the panic rising within him. As she observed, Sophie realized how quickly the entire atmosphere had shifted. The receptionist, who had barely spared a glance at her the day before, was now treating her with exaggerated courtesy. But Sophie was no fool. She could see right through it. His behavior hadn't changed, just his facade. The dismissive attitude he had toward the other guests, especially the older ones, was still fresh in her mind. Now, he was simply trying to cover up his past actions, hoping she wouldn't notice. Sophie took a deep breath and made her decision. She wasn't going to let this go. "I need to speak with the entire front desk team right now," she said firmly. There was no room for negotiation in her voice. The receptionist's face turned pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he nodded and quickly turned to gather the other employees. Sophie stood there, watching them rush about in an attempt to compose themselves. She knew they were all aware of her presence. Now that they realized who she was, they must have known the jig was up. But Sophie wasn't interested in making them squirm. She had a larger purpose now, one that went far beyond a single encounter. As the front desk team gathered in the back room, Sophie walked in and took a seat at the head of the table. Her presence commanding attention, she motioned for everyone to sit, and the room grew eerily quiet. The receptionist from the day before, along with a few others, stood nervously at the back of the room. Sophie could feel their discomfort but remained silent, watching them squirm. She then stood and spoke calmly. "Yesterday, I witnessed several things that cannot be ignored any longer. This is not a matter of a simple mistake or one bad employee. This is a failure of our system, and it must change immediately." She pressed a button on her tablet, and the video feed of the previous day's interactions began to play on the large screen in the front of the room. The footage showed the receptionist treating the elderly woman with cold indifference, ignoring her requests for assistance, and the way he had dismissed others based on their appearance. Sophie watched the reactions of the staff as the video played, noting how they looked away, how some shuffled uncomfortably. Their guilt was palpable. Sophie turned her gaze back to the receptionist, who was now standing with his shoulders hunched. He opened his mouth to speak but faltered. His words stuck in his throat. She gave him no chance to explain. Instead, she addressed the entire room. "This cannot continue. This kind of behavior undermines everything we stand for as a company. I am disappointed, and I expect immediate changes. No one here is exempt from this responsibility. If you think this is a one-time mistake, then you are gravely mistaken," Sophie declared, her voice cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. The receptionist stood still, eyes wide with realization that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had ever imagined. Sophie continued, "There will be an immediate re-evaluation of our employee training programs. And for those who cannot meet the standards of respect and professionalism we expect, there will be consequences." She let those words hang in the air for a moment, then added with a sharpness that left no room for doubt. We are a luxury brand, and we cannot afford to treat our guests with anything less than the utmost respect. Not today, not ever. Sophie's gaze locked with the receptionist's. For a brief moment, she saw him swallow hard. His confidence shattered. He opened his mouth again, but the words he had prepared seemed to evaporate. Instead, he nodded quietly, his shoulders sagging as he took in the weight of the situation. Turning to the rest of the staff, Sophie concluded, "We'll begin with a new training program that emphasizes empathy, respect, and service excellence. I'll be checking back in regularly to ensure this is followed through." With that, Sophie dismissed the group. There was no applause, no congratulations, just a heavy silence as they filed out, each person left to grapple with what had just unfolded. As the last person left the room, Sophie sank back into her chair. The weight of what she had just set in motion was sinking in. She wasn't just addressing one employee's failure, she was confronting the culture that had allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Sophie wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She was determined to see this through, to rebuild the culture of her company, one decision at a time. Sophie Daniels stood before the conference table, her eyes scanning the room. Every staff member who had been involved in the incident from the day before was there. From the receptionist who had greeted her with disdain to the other employees who had witnessed the behavior. The tension in the air was palpable. They all knew that something serious was about to happen. Sophie's presence commanded respect, but it also carried a weight that left no room for excuses. "Thank you all for gathering on short notice," Sophie began, her voice steady and authoritative. "We need to address an issue that goes far beyond one employee. What I witnessed yesterday is not just a mistake. It's part of a much larger problem within this company, and it needs to change now." She paused, allowing her words to settle. The room fell silent, and the staff shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sophie's eyes landed on the receptionist, his face pale, his hands twitching nervously as he avoided eye contact. Yesterday's behavior was not only unprofessional but completely unacceptable for any staff member representing this hotel. Sophie continued, "It is clear that this attitude isn't isolated to one person. It's a systemic issue, and I will not allow it to continue. There will be a full review of our training programs for all staff. And I expect everyone to take part in that. If we don't make these changes, we risk losing everything we've worked for." She could see the receptionist's lips quiver slightly, but he remained silent, his head lowered. Sophie wasn't done yet. "I want to make it clear that this behavior was not just about a single incident. It's about respect. Respect for our guests and respect for the values that this hotel has always stood for. And for that reason, we will be taking immediate action," Sophie declared, her tone unwavering. The receptionist looked up at her, opening his mouth to speak, but Sophie raised her hand, stopping him before he could defend himself. "I know what you're going to say," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You were simply following protocol, right? But protocol cannot be an excuse for treating guests with disdain. I have watched the footage, and I've heard the complaints. I've seen the indifference, the lack of empathy, and I can't just let this go." The room seemed to hold its breath. Sophie's gaze shifted back to the receptionist, who now shifted uneasily in his seat. His earlier defiance had evaporated, replaced by a palpable fear. Sophie took a deep breath, her decision clear. "I'm sorry, but you're fired. Effective immediately. Your behavior is not aligned with the values we hold here. And if you can't respect our guests, then you can't be part of this team." A stunned silence filled the room. The receptionist's face reddened with a mix of shock and anger. He opened his mouth to protest, but Sophie wasn't interested in hearing any more excuses. "What is your problem with our guests?" Sophie asked him, her eyes narrowing. "It's not about protocol. It's about basic human decency. You failed to treat them with kindness. And for that, there are consequences." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His voice, now tinged with anger, filled the room. "You think this is over? You have no idea what you're doing. I've been here for years. I know people in higher places. People who can make sure this doesn't go as smoothly as you think. You can't just fire me and expect no repercussions." Sophie's eyes never left his face. "If you believe that, Then you've misunderstood who I am, she said coldly. I am the CEO, and I make the decisions here. If you want to make this difficult, go ahead, but know this. Your departure won't change the fact that things are changing around here. And it's for the better. The receptionist glared at her for a moment, his chest rising and falling with anger. Then, with a final frustrated glance at the staff in the room, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the room, leaving a strange sense of finality hanging in the air. Sophie stood still for a moment, her hand resting on the back of the chair. She could hear the murmurs of disbelief from the others in the room. But she wasn't fazed. She had made the right decision. This was a necessary first step toward rebuilding the company's reputation and culture. When she spoke again, her voice was calm but resolute. This is only the beginning. We will be implementing a complete overhaul of our customer service training. And I'll personally oversee it. There will be no more tolerating behavior like this. It doesn't matter how long someone has worked here or what relationships they have. If you can't treat our guests with the respect they deserve, then you don't belong here. The room was silent, but Sophie could feel the shift. The other employees, who had been quietly observing, now realized the gravity of what had just occurred. The receptionist's departure was not just a firing, it was a statement. A promise that things were about to change. As the meeting ended and the staff slowly filed out of the room, Sophie felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The decision had been hard, but it was necessary. She knew there was much more work to be done, but she was ready for it. There would be no more excuses, no more tolerance for mediocrity. Sophie had drawn a line in the sand, and now it was time for the rest of the company to step up. The decision to fire the receptionist was only the beginning. Sophie knew, though the immediate atmosphere in the hotel seemed lighter, with staff members breathing a collective sigh of relief. There was an undercurrent of tension. The employees were starting to realize that change was coming, but not everyone was entirely comfortable with it. Some were unsure if Sophie's actions would lead to lasting change or if they were just another fleeting attempt to address a deeper issue. The rumors quickly spread across the hotel, and Sophie overheard one of the longtime employees, Danny, voicing his concerns. He was sitting in the break room, speaking quietly to a fellow colleague. But Sophie, ever vigilant, caught the words that made her pause. I'm not sure this is the solution, Danny said, his voice heavy with doubt. Firing one person doesn't change the fact that the whole system is messed up. It's bigger than just one receptionist. The real problem is how we've been treating customers for years. Do you think one dismissal will fix that? Sophie's brow furrowed as she listened, and the words hung in the air. Danny was right. Firing the receptionist was a necessary step, but it was only the tip of the iceberg. The issues he was speaking of were far deeper, ingrained in the very culture of the hotel. Determined to get to the root of the problem, Sophie knew she couldn't just ignore Danny's concerns. She had to dig deeper, not just for her own peace of mind but for the future of the company. She approached Emily, another employee who had worked with her for some time, and asked her directly about the broader atmosphere among the staff. Emily, Danny mentioned some troubling things about the way we treat guests. Sophie began, her tone calm but probing. Is he right? Are there more employees with the same mindset? Emily hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. But Sophie could see the hesitation in her eyes. She had worked with Emily long enough to know that she wouldn't sugarcoat the truth. There are some, Emily admitted quietly, but it's not just the front desk. The attitudes you saw yesterday. They're in other departments too. Some of the supervisors, they've been with the company for years, and they think they know better than the guests. They don't treat them with the respect they deserve. Sophie felt a wave of frustration but also relief that Emily had been honest. The problems were systemic, not just isolated to a few bad apples. Sophie's fears were confirmed, but now she had the full scope of the challenge in front of her. But Sophie's investigation didn't stop there. A few hours later, she received an email that made her stomach tighten. It was from Richard Langley, the regional manager, someone she had worked closely with for years. Richard was usually pragmatic, but the tone of his message was more urgent than usual. Sophie, the email began, I understand your decision to let the receptionist go, but I must warn you that this could cause ripple effects through the team. The staff is already on edge. And this move might put a strain on the relationships within the team. It's crucial that we consider the bigger picture here. Richard's words were carefully measured, but Sophie could tell he was concerned. He continued in the email. Implementing changes too quickly could have a negative impact on our revenue. We've had loyal customers who might not understand such sudden shifts. You've always been a strong leader. But I urge you to be cautious. We can't afford to alienate anyone, least of all the staff we rely on. Reading between the lines, Sophie could sense Richard's unease. He wasn't just worried about the immediate fallout, he was concerned about the long-term consequences of implementing changes too abruptly. Sophie understood his concerns, but she also knew that change was necessary. Whether the staff was ready for it or not, she couldn't afford to sit idly by while the company's core values eroded any further. Sophie decided she would push forward, but she needed to gather more information. She needed to understand just how deep the rot went. The next day, she arranged a meeting with some of the senior supervisors and department heads. She needed to hear from them directly. She asked Emily and Danny to provide specific examples of what they had seen or experienced within their departments. The more information she could gather, the better equipped she would be to tackle the larger systemic issues. Sophie wasn't looking for excuses. She wasn't interested in hearing about the stress the employees were under or how busy they were. She wanted them to confront the reality. The company's culture had been corrupted by years of complacency. And it had to change. During the meeting with the senior staff, Sophie outlined the direction she intended to take. I will be implementing a comprehensive training program for all employees, she said, her voice firm. It will focus on customer service. But not just the basics. We need to dig deeper. We need to teach our employees empathy, respect, and how to genuinely connect with our guests. The room was quiet as Sophie spoke. She could see the staff members exchanging glances, some of them unsure of what to make of her bold approach. But she didn't care about their doubts. This was bigger than their discomfort. It was about saving the company's reputation and ensuring that every guest felt valued. I'm also going to institute regular reviews and feedback sessions, Sophie continued. I won't let this slide. If we don't change now, we risk losing everything we've built. And that's not an option. There was a long silence after she finished speaking. Finally, one of the department heads, a woman named Linda, cleared her throat. We hear you, Sophie, Linda said, her voice hesitant but respectful. But you're asking for a lot. This won't be easy. Some people might not be open to these changes. I know, Sophie said, her voice unwavering. But it's time. No more excuses. The meeting ended with a sense of quiet determination. Sophie knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth, but she was prepared for it. This was only the beginning of a much larger overhaul. She couldn't afford to stop now. As she sat in her office later that afternoon, Sophie reflected on the challenges ahead. The road to transformation would be long and difficult, but the thought of the change that was coming, of creating a hotel where every guest, regardless of their background, was treated with dignity, made her feel more resolute than ever. The weight of what Sophie was facing began to sink in more with each passing day. She had thought the problem was contained to a few isolated incidents. But the deeper she dug, the clearer it became that the issues ran much deeper than she had anticipated. From the front desk staff to the supervisors and managers, the culture of indifference, disrespect, and poor service had woven itself into the very fabric of the hotel. It was a toxic culture that had been allowed to fester over the years. Sophie realized that simply firing a few bad employees would not fix the problem. She needed help. Someone who understood the inner workings of the company and could help her root out the systemic issues. But where could she find someone she could trust? She needed a plan that would allow her to make lasting changes without disrupting the entire operation. After much thought, Sophie decided to seek out an ally, someone who had been on the inside and had tried to change things before. Someone who had seen how deep the problem went. It wasn't long before she reached out to Karen Shaw, a former senior manager who had been forced to resign after she had tried to implement changes to the company's customer service policies. Sophie had heard whispers about Karen's work ethic and how she had been a fierce advocate for improving guest experiences. But her efforts had been shut down by the higher-ups. Karen had always been known for speaking her mind, even when it meant stepping on toes. Sophie figured that if anyone knew how to navigate the murky waters of the hotel's management, it would be her. When they finally met, Karen was hesitant at first. Sophie could sense the bitterness in her eyes, the scars from a battle she had lost. But there was also a flicker of hope, a recognition that Sophie might be the person who could finally make the changes Karen had tried so hard to implement. "I've been watching what you're doing," Karen said quietly, almost as if testing Sophie's resolve. "And I have to say, it's about time someone with the power to do something took a stand. I've been on the inside, Sophie, and I know what it's like to try and fix this place. They don't care. They never did." Sophie leaned forward, her tone serious. "I need your help, Karen. I need to understand exactly what's been going on. Why wasn't anything done? Why did you leave?" Karen paused, her eyes flickering to the floor as if reliving the painful memories. "Because they don't want to change," she said, shaking her head. "I tried to implement a new customer service protocol. But Richard Langley, he's the one you need to be worried about. He blocked everything I tried to do. He said it would cost too much, that we couldn't afford to implement those changes. He doesn't care about the guests. He doesn't care about the reputation of this place. He only cares about profits." Sophie's stomach churned. The picture that was emerging was not just about a few bad apples in the front line, it was about a systemic failure. Richard Langley, the regional manager, had been using his position to protect a culture of indifference that favored profits over people. Sophie had already suspected as much, but hearing it from someone who had been on the front lines gave her the confirmation she needed. Karen continued, "I tried to take it higher, but every time I spoke up, I was shot down. Richard has connections, Sophie. He's been there long enough to know how to keep things running smoothly for him while the rest of us are left to deal with the mess." The words hit Sophie hard, but she knew this wasn't the time to back down. Karen had a point. This wasn't just about improving service standards, it was about dismantling an entire system that had been built on exploiting both guests and employees. Sophie took a deep breath and made a decision. "Tell me everything," she said firmly. "All of it. I need to know what's been happening. And I need you to help me bring this down." Karen nodded, a mixture of relief and caution crossing her face. "I'll help you, but you have to understand that this is going to get ugly. Richard won't just sit back and let you undo everything he's built." Sophie nodded. "I'm ready. I'm not going to let this continue. Not when I know what's at stake." As they discussed the details, Karen provided Sophie with key information about how Richard had been manipulating guest data to prioritize high-spending customers while neglecting the needs of others. She also revealed how policies were set up to encourage employees to focus on numbers rather than customer care, leading to a lack of genuine service. Sophie was shocked by the extent of the corruption, but she knew it wasn't just about changing the way employees interacted with guests. It was about changing the entire philosophy of the company. But Sophie needed more information. She needed to understand how the financial policies that Richard had put in place affected the entire system. If the hotel's profits were being prioritized over guest experience, then Sophie knew she had to expose the full scope of what was happening. She turned to Emily and Danny, two employees who had shown loyalty to her cause. She asked them to provide any additional insights into how financial decisions were being made, especially when it came to how resources were allocated to customer service. Emily, who had worked in accounting, began to dig into the budget with Sophie's encouragement, revealing how the financial department had been cutting corners to increase profit margins at the expense of maintaining the quality of service. As Sophie pieced together all of this information, she began to understand just how deep the problem went. She realized that the company was not just dealing with bad management or poor employee attitudes, it was a deeply embedded culture of exploitation, where profits were prioritized above everything else. And now, Sophie felt the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. She had to change this, not just for the guests, but for the employees who were being exploited, and for the reputation of the brand she had spent so many years building. With Karen's help, Sophie started making a plan. It would be a long and difficult journey, but Sophie knew it was the only way forward. She was prepared for the fight that lay ahead, and she was ready to face the full scope of the corruption, no matter how uncomfortable it might get. The tension was thick as Sophie sat across from Richard Langley, the regional manager of her hotel chain. The sleek conference room, typically a place for important meetings and strategic planning, now felt more like a battleground. Sophie had called Richard in to confront him directly, to get answers to the troubling revelations that had been steadily surfacing. She knew that he was the key player behind many of the company's questionable decisions. And now, it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. Sophie had spent hours going over the evidence Karen Shaw had provided her, testimonies, emails, and memos, all pointing to Richard's manipulation of the company's customer service policies. Sophie knew that Richard was smart, but she also knew that no one could escape the truth once it was laid bare. The meeting was her opportunity to expose the cracks in the system he had worked so hard to maintain. Richard, Sophie began, her voice steady but firm. I called you in today because I need answers. Karen Shaw, and several other employees, have made it clear that there are deep-rooted issues with how we've been treating our guests. Specifically, I want to hear from you about the policies that have led to this mess. Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. He appeared calm, almost too calm, as if he were bracing for an argument he had already prepared for. Sophie could see the hint of a smirk on his lips, the kind that said he was already planning his defense. Of course, Sophie, Richard replied smoothly, his voice even. I've always worked in the best interest of this company. Everything I've done was to ensure the profitability and smooth operation of our locations. You know how it works. If we don't prioritize high-paying clients, we risk losing business. I made decisions that were best for the bottom line. Sophie's gaze hardened as she listened to his words. She had heard similar justifications before, but this time, they didn't sit right. Richard, the bottom line can't come at the expense of our integrity. The behaviors that have been happening, treating some guests like they don't matter while prioritizing others based solely on their spending power, that's not acceptable. It's destroying the reputation of this company. She slid a folder across the table toward him. Inside were copies of the reports and recordings Karen had gathered, each one more damning than the last. Sophie could see Richard's eyes flicker over the pages, his composed exterior beginning to crack ever so slightly. I understand that you may feel these were necessary decisions, but they were wrong. They harmed our guests, and now, they're hurting our brand. Sophie continued, her voice unwavering. You've let this go on for too long, and the consequences are clear. Richard's smirk faded as his eyes narrowed. He straightened in his seat, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged in this way. You think firing a few staff members and implementing some training programs is going to fix this? He asked with a dismissive tone. Sophie, you're walking into a storm you don't fully understand. You're destabilizing everything. Sophie's eyes locked onto his, her jaw set with determination. This is not just about firing staff. It's about changing the culture of this company. If you can't get on board with that, then you need to step aside. Because I won't let this company be run by people who care only about profits and not the people we serve. The room grew quiet, the only sound being the faint rustling of papers as Sophie continued to look at Richard. She could see the defiance in his eyes, but also something else, fear. For the first time, Sophie realized that he wasn't just worried about his position. He was worried about the system he had built crumbling beneath him. Don't be naive, Sophie, Richard finally said, his voice low and edged with a hint of threat. If you continue down this path, you'll lose more than just a few employees. The board won't stand for it. The managers who have supported me, people who hold real power in this company, will fight back. Do you really think you can take on all of us? Sophie paused, letting his words sink in. She had always known that challenging the system would be difficult, but hearing Richard's implicit threats made it all too real. He wasn't just fighting for his position. He was protecting a much larger network of people who had been complicit in the company's misdeeds. For a moment, Sophie felt the weight of the battle ahead, but then she reminded herself why she had started this fight in the first place. She wasn't in this for power or for control. She was in it for the people who had been overlooked, ignored, or mistreated for far too long. I'm not intimidated by threats, Richard, Sophie said, her voice steady. If the board decides to go against what's right, then I'll deal with that when the time comes. But I'm not going to stand by and let you manipulate this company any longer. The truth is out, and you can't hide from it. Richard's face turned a shade paler, but his gaze remained cold. You're playing a dangerous game, Sophie, and when it all falls apart, you'll have no one to blame but yourself. Sophie's heart pounded, but her resolve only strengthened. She knew that the road ahead would be tough, but she was ready to face it head on. The fight wasn't just about her, it was about the integrity of the company, the welfare of its employees, and the satisfaction of its guests. I don't need anyone's approval to do what's right, Sophie said firmly. I'm not backing down, Richard, and if you stand in my way, I'll expose everything. The world will know what you've been hiding. Richard stared at her for a long moment, and then, without another word, he stood up and walked out of the room, his steps heavy with the weight of the battle he knew was coming. Sophie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The confrontation had been tense, but it was only the beginning. She had now crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Sophie understood that her fight wasn't just against Richard, it was against a corrupt system, a culture that needed to be dismantled. And no matter how long it took, she was ready for the war ahead. After the tense confrontation with Richard Langley, Sophie realized that the battle for her company was far from over. It wasn't just a matter of fixing a few bad apples, it was about tackling a deeply ingrained culture of negligence and corruption that had festered for years. Richard had made it clear that he wasn't going to give up his grip on the company without a fight. But Sophie wasn't backing down. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that she needed to expand her efforts. She needed allies. Determined to move forward, Sophie began building a coalition of employees she could trust, those who had witnessed firsthand the flaws in the system and were as eager for change as she was. Emily and Danny, two employees who had consistently supported Sophie's efforts to make things better, quickly became her first recruits. They were both deeply disillusioned with the state of the company and had seen how bad things had gotten. But they had remained silent for too long, unsure of how to make a difference. Sophie reached out to them and asked for their help in gathering more evidence. And they didn't hesitate to agree. I've seen it, Sophie, Danny said, his voice low and hesitant as they sat together in the quiet of the office one afternoon. I've worked here long enough to know the game. But it's not just Richard, it's all the senior managers. They're in on it. They don't care about the customers, they just care about hitting numbers. That's what's been destroying everything. Emily nodded in agreement. I used to be part of the accounting team. I've seen the way they manipulate the numbers. They cut corners everywhere they can. And it's all to boost the bottom line. Even if it means cutting services for the people who keep the hotel running, our guests. Sophie absorbed their words carefully. She had already suspected there was more to the situation than just poor customer service. Now, it seemed as if she had uncovered the heart of the problem: greed, manipulation, and a blatant disregard for the very values the company had once prided itself on. The staff's treatment of guests, the financial mismanagement, the dishonesty, it all pointed to a deeper, more systematic issue. Sophie didn't waste any time. She and her new allies began their investigation. Diving deeper into the company's operations, they scoured through internal meetings, financial documents, and hidden memos, anything that could provide evidence of the corruption she had suspected. It didn't take long for them to uncover something disturbing. Several of the regional managers, including Richard, had been involved in a scheme to manipulate customer data to prioritize high-paying guests while neglecting the needs of others. The most shocking revelation came when Sophie found a report from an anonymous employee that detailed how these managers had reduced services for lower-spending guests to maximize profits, all while inflating the company's financial figures to appear more successful. Sophie stared at the documents in disbelief. The more she read, the more enraged she became. It wasn't just about a few bad decisions, it was a well-oiled machine built to prioritize profit at the expense of everyone else. Sophie could feel the weight of the task ahead of her. She wasn't just battling one individual, she was up against a deeply rooted culture that needed to be completely overhauled. She took a deep breath, knowing the road ahead would be long and filled with resistance. But she had no choice now. The only way to save the company was to clean house completely, not just in terms of firing a few employees, but by dismantling the system that allowed this kind of behavior to thrive. Sophie needed to confront Richard and the other regional managers head-on, exposing their actions and holding them accountable. She scheduled a meeting with Richard and the other senior executives, knowing that this would be the most difficult confrontation she had yet faced. It wasn't just about reprimanding a few individuals, it was about calling out the entire system for what it was, a broken, corrupt structure that had no place in the future of her company. As the day of the meeting approached, Sophie felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. She was ready for the confrontation, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. Richard and the others wouldn't go down without a fight. But Sophie had reached a point where she knew she couldn't turn back. This wasn't just about her position or reputation, it was about doing what was right for the company and for the people who had been mistreated for so long. When the meeting finally took place, Sophie walked into the room with the full knowledge that she was about to challenge not only Richard but a network of powerful figures who had been controlling the company for years. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken questions. Sophie stood at the head of the table, her voice calm but firm. "I know what's been going on," she said, looking directly at Richard, who sat with a scowl on his face. "I know about the manipulation, the data tampering, the way certain guests have been prioritized over others. You've all been a part of this, and I'm not going to let it continue." Richard's face twisted into a sneer. But Sophie wasn't intimidated. She had the facts, and she was ready to lay them all on the table. "You can no longer hide behind the guise of business as usual. This stops now." Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're up against, Sophie. If you expose this, the fallout will be catastrophic. The board won't back you. Do you really want to risk everything over some misguided notion of fairness?" Sophie stood her ground, her resolve unshaken. "I'm not risking anything. You are. And if you continue to put profits over people, then you'll lose everything. I will expose this if I have to. But this company will not continue down the path you've set it on. Not under my watch." As the room went silent, Sophie could feel the tension building. Richard's defiant expression slowly shifted, replaced by one of uncertainty. He knew the truth had been exposed, and there was no escaping it now. Sophie made one last declaration. "I'm not just here to address individual mistakes. I'm here to tear down the system that allowed this to happen. Starting with you and anyone else who is complicit. You have a choice. Change or face the consequences. The decision is yours." Sophie sat in her office, the weight of the decision she had made settling heavily on her shoulders. It was time to finally confront Richard Langley and the other regional managers who had manipulated the system for so long. Sophie knew this meeting would be the pivotal moment in her battle to reclaim control of her company. This wasn't just about reforming policies, it was about dismantling an entrenched system of corruption that had been festering for years. The stakes were high, and she had no intention of backing down. She had spent countless hours compiling evidence, emails, recordings, internal reports from anonymous employees, all pointing to the same conclusion. Richard and several other senior managers had been involved in manipulating customer service policies to prioritize high-spending clients, all while neglecting the needs of lower-paying guests. Sophie couldn't let this go any longer. The damage had already been done, but it wasn't too late to fix it. Sophie stood up from her desk and walked to the window, looking out over the city below. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay composed in the face of adversity. But she knew that this confrontation was unlike any other she had faced. The future of the company hung in the balance, and the people sitting across from her in the meeting were the ones responsible for the mess she was about to clean up. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the conference room where the board members were waiting. As she entered, all eyes were on her. Richard, his usual smug demeanor replaced with a thinly veiled scowl, sat at the head of the table, flanked by other senior managers. Sophie could sense the tension in the room. They knew this wasn't going to be a typical meeting. "I called this meeting because we need to discuss the future of this company," Sophie began, her voice calm but firm. "What I've uncovered in my investigation is deeply troubling. There are issues within our management structure that go beyond poor customer service. There's been a deliberate effort to manipulate our operations in a way that benefits a select few. And that ends now." The room fell silent. Sophie clicked a button on her tablet, and the large screen at the front of the room flickered to life. A series of slides appeared, showing the evidence she had gathered, emails, call logs, and internal memos all detailing the deliberate actions taken to prioritize high-spending guests and cut services for others. She watched as the faces of the managers around the table shifted from confident to defensive. Sophie turned to Richard. I have evidence that you and your colleagues have been actively involved in this. You've been using your position to manipulate guest data, prioritize certain customers, and undermine the principles that this company was built on. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His face flushed. This is absurd, Sophie, he said, his voice rising. I've done what's necessary to keep the business running. This is about profitability. You can't just make these changes on a whim. If you follow through with this, we risk losing everything. Sophie's gaze never wavered. What we risk losing is the integrity of this company. Richard, I've heard enough excuses. The truth is clear, and there's no hiding from it any longer. Richard's jaw clenched, and his fists tightened on the table. You're playing a dangerous game. He spat. You think the board is going to support you in this? You'll be throwing everything away for a few disgruntled employees and a misguided sense of fairness. This could destroy everything we've worked for. Sophie paused, allowing his words to sink in. She knew the cost of standing up to Richard and the others would be high. But she had already made up her mind. I've already made arrangements to expose this information to the press. Richard, if you and the other members of the board don't accept the changes I'm proposing, I will take this public. The world will know what's been happening behind closed doors. The tension in the room was palpable. Sophie could feel the collective gasp of disbelief. Richard's face turned even darker as the realization hit him. Sophie wasn't bluffing. She had the power, the evidence, and the determination to see this through. You can't do that, Richard said, his voice shaking with anger. If you expose this, the company will fall apart. We'll lose our clients, our reputation, everything. You're not just jeopardizing this company. You're jeopardizing everything we've built. Sophie didn't flinch. If you think that continuing down this path is what's best for this company, then you've completely misunderstood the situation. It's not about protecting your position. It's about protecting the company's future. And right now, we need to fix the system before it's too late. She looked around the table at the other senior managers. I'm not just asking for a change in policy. I'm asking for a complete overhaul of how we do business. We're going to focus on fairness, transparency, and putting the needs of our guests first. If you can't get on board with that, then I'll have no choice but to take further action. Richard's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Sophie thought he might retaliate in some way. But instead, he simply leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. Fine, he muttered. You've made your point, but don't think this is over. You can't just rewrite the rules like this. Sophie stood tall. This isn't about rewriting the rules, Richard. It's about bringing them back to the basics, respect for our guests, fairness, and honesty. If you're not willing to accept that, then you're not part of the future of this company. The room was silent for a long moment before one of the other managers, a man named Gregory, spoke up. Sophie's right. We can't ignore this any longer. It's time for a change. If we want to survive, we have to adapt. One by one, the other managers reluctantly nodded in agreement. Sophie knew this wasn't a victory won easily, but it was a victory nonetheless. Richard had been backed into a corner, and now, the entire board was forced to accept that change was inevitable. But Sophie knew this was just the beginning. The system had been corrupted for too long, and there was much more work to be done. She had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Now, she had to focus on rebuilding, on changing the culture from the inside out. It wouldn't be easy. But Sophie was ready for whatever came next. The confrontation with the board had been intense, but it was only the beginning. Sophie knew that winning the battle didn't guarantee the war was over. She had shaken the foundation of the company, but now she had to rebuild it, starting with the very core of its operations, the way its employees treated the customers. Sophie wasted no time. She immediately implemented a comprehensive training program for all employees, focusing on customer service, respect, and professionalism. This wasn't just about teaching the basics of politeness. Sophie wanted to instill a culture of genuine care and attention, where every guest felt valued, no matter their background or spending power. She worked closely with the supervisors and department heads to make sure that the new standards weren't just talked about, but put into practice. It was clear that Sophie's efforts were starting to show results. The employees, particularly those who had been skeptical or indifferent before, were now beginning to adjust. There was still some reluctance in the air, but Sophie was determined. As the training programs unfolded, the employees who embraced the changes stood out, both in their interactions with guests and in their willingness to hold each other accountable. Sophie worked directly with the management team, setting clear expectations for what was to come. "We're not just changing policies," she explained one morning during a meeting with the senior staff. "We're changing the culture. If we can't treat our guests with respect and genuinely put their needs first, then we have no business calling ourselves a luxury hotel." She had made it clear that anyone unwilling to adapt would not be a part of the future of the company. But even with the positive changes in the air, Sophie knew this was just the beginning. There was still a lot more to uncover. The investigation into the company's financial practices continued as Sophie, along with Karen Shaw and a few loyal employees, dove deeper into the books. They uncovered several troubling policies that had been in place for years, decisions that had prioritized profit margins over guest satisfaction. Sophie wasn't surprised to find that Richard Langley had been involved in more than just manipulating customer service policies. His influence ran deeper than she had initially thought. As the team dug through financial records, Sophie began to put the pieces together. Richard and several regional managers had been involved in an illicit business deal with a competing company. They had been diverting resources and creating false reports to line their own pockets. The financial manipulation was far more extensive than Sophie could have imagined. What was even more troubling was the fact that it had all been hidden in plain sight. The company's books had been doctored, and the real financial situation had been kept from the board. Sophie felt her blood run cold as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Richard Langley wasn't just a corrupt manager, he was a player in a much larger game. This wasn't just about a few bad decisions anymore. This was a full-blown scandal that had the potential to ruin everything. But Sophie wasn't one to back down. She had already made up her mind. The truth needed to be exposed. There was no going back now. The changes she was making within the company were important, but they weren't enough. If Sophie wanted to protect the company, she had to confront the corruption head-on and make sure it never happened again. Sophie knew she had to face Richard again, but this time, the stakes were much higher. She couldn't just fire him and move on. This was bigger than that. Sophie began to prepare for a legal battle. She gathered all the evidence she could find, from financial records to emails and recordings. And she knew she had a case. But she also understood that taking this public would bring a firestorm of media attention. There would be questions, investigations, and likely a lot of backlash. But Sophie wasn't afraid of the fallout. She had come this far, and there was no turning back. She had to protect the company and restore its integrity, no matter the cost. The news of the impending legal action began to spread through the company. Some employees whispered nervously, unsure of what was to come. Others, however, were emboldened by Sophie's strength. They could see that she was fighting for something bigger than just a corporate makeover. She was fighting for fairness, for honesty, and for the heart of the company that had been stolen from them. As the day of the meeting with Richard approached, Sophie felt the weight of the decision on her shoulders. She knew that this confrontation wouldn't just change the trajectory of the company, it would change everything. It was a fight for the company's soul, and Sophie wasn't going to back down. When Richard finally walked into her office, he was different. Gone was the arrogant smirk, the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. He looked tense, wary, even a little defeated, but Sophie wasn't fooled by the change in his demeanor. She had come too far to be swayed by his charm. "I know what you've been doing, Richard," Sophie said, her voice calm but firm. "And I have all the evidence I need to take this to the authorities. You've manipulated the company's finances. You've diverted resources. And you've caused irreparable harm to this brand." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but Sophie held up a hand. "Don't try to deny it. I have everything, and I'm going to make sure the world knows what you've done." The anger in his eyes flared, but Sophie was resolute. "This isn't just about you anymore. This is about the company, the people who work here, and the future we're building. You're not part of that future." Richard's face darkened, but he said nothing. Sophie could feel the intensity of the moment. This was it. There was no more negotiating, no more compromising. Richard had crossed the line, and now he would face the consequences. As Richard left her office, Sophie felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The fight wasn't over, but this was a crucial step. She had taken a stand. And now, the real work could begin. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles. But Sophie was ready. This was her company, and she would not let it be destroyed by corruption. The weight of the discovery hit Sophie like a ton of bricks. Richard Langley's manipulation of company policies and his involvement in illicit business deals had shattered the trust she had placed in him. But what was even more unnerving was the realization that this corruption didn't stop with Richard. It had spread through the ranks, infecting every layer of the company's operations. Sophie knew she couldn't keep this information hidden anymore. It was time to expose the truth, not just to the board, but to the world. She could no longer stand by and let the company's reputation continue to crumble under the weight of secrecy and greed. Sophie spent sleepless nights compiling every piece of evidence she had gathered. From Richard's under-the-table deals to the financial documents that showed clear manipulation of customer data. She knew that what she was about to do could tear the company apart. But she also understood that if she didn't act, it would be the company itself that would be torn down in the end. The decision wasn't easy. Sophie was torn between the urge to expose everything immediately and the need to protect herself and those around her. She couldn't ignore the risk of retaliation from the very people who had built this corrupt system. The higher-ups, the people who had been in power for so long, wouldn't give up their influence easily. But Sophie had never been one to shy away from a challenge. The truth was out there, and it was time for everyone to know. After careful consideration, Sophie decided that the time to act was now. She could not wait any longer. She had to protect the company's integrity and take down the people who had led it astray. Sophie gathered the evidence and sent it to the authorities, as well as to the press. She requested an emergency meeting with the board of directors, determined to expose everything right then and there. The meeting was tense from the moment she walked into the room. Sophie had anticipated the pushback, but nothing could have prepared her for the level of resistance she would face. The board members sat in front of her, their expressions ranging from disbelief to open hostility. Richard, of course, was sitting at the head of the table, looking unusually pale. Sophie wasted no time. "I have documents, emails, and recordings that show the extent of the corruption within this company," she began, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "Richard Langley and several others have been involved in manipulating the system for their own personal gain. This isn't just about bad decisions. This is about systematic fraud, and I'm not going to let it continue." She displayed the documents on the large screen in front of them, the weight of the truth staring everyone in the face. The room fell silent as the evidence unfolded. There was no denying it anymore. The facts were clear. Sophie could see Richard's hands trembling as he tried to process what was happening. Richard's face twisted with anger, but his voice remained calm, though it was laced with a venom that Sophie had never heard from him before. "This is madness, Sophie," he spat. "You think you can just expose everything and walk away unscathed? You don't have any idea what you're doing. You're going to ruin the company for this, for a few mistakes?" "A couple of missteps?" Sophie stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. "This isn't a few mistakes. Richard, you've been running a scheme that has hurt our guests, damaged the company's reputation, and cost us a lot more than money. If you want to talk about missteps, what you've done is far worse. You've used your position to manipulate the system and cover up your actions. That's not a mistake. That's a crime." The room was thick with tension, and Sophie could feel the eyes of the board members on her. Some looking uncomfortable, others clearly defensive. She wasn't finished yet. "This is about much more than a few bad decisions," Sophie continued. "This is about the company's values. If we want to move forward, we need to restore integrity. And that starts with removing those who have poisoned the system." Richard's expression darkened. He tried to speak, but Sophie raised her hand to silence him. She wasn't done. "If you don't accept the changes I'm proposing, if you don't support these reforms, I'll make sure the truth comes out. I'll send this information to the media. I'll make sure every shareholder, every customer knows exactly what's been happening behind the scenes. If you don't want that kind of public scrutiny, then you'll do what's necessary to ensure these changes are implemented." For a long moment, Richard sat frozen, the color draining from his face. He had always prided himself on being in control, on having the upper hand. But now he could see that Sophie had taken the power back. There was a long pause before one of the board members, a man named Harold, finally spoke. "This is unprecedented," he said, his voice hesitant, "but the evidence is overwhelming. Richard, I think you should step down." The room seemed to hold its breath. Richard's face twisted in anger. But he knew, in that moment, that his reign was over. He had been cornered. There was no escape. "I'll step down," Richard finally muttered, his voice low and filled with resentment. "But know this, Sophie, you've made a dangerous enemy today." Sophie didn't flinch. She knew that Richard wasn't the only one who had been complicit. There were others who had turned a blind eye to his actions, who had allowed this toxic culture to persist. But that would change. "Starting now, I'm not backing down," Sophie said firmly. "I will ensure this company is rebuilt from the ground up. And I will not let anyone who was part of this corruption stand in the way. It's time for a change." With Richard's resignation confirmed, the room began to settle, and the board members reluctantly agreed to the changes Sophie had proposed. But Sophie knew that this was just the first step. There would be many more battles to fight, and many more hurdles to overcome. But she was ready for them. Sophie didn't just want to fix the company's problems. She wanted to tear down the system that had allowed them to fester for so long. She wasn't done yet, and she wasn't going to stop until she had restored the company to its rightful place, where integrity and respect were the foundations, not manipulation and greed. Sophie had done it. The company was hers again. She had fought tooth and nail to regain control. And now, the changes she had initiated were beginning to take root. She had reshaped the company's policies to ensure transparency, fairness, and a level of integrity that had been sorely lacking for years. But even though the surface had been scrubbed clean, the deeper wounds within the organization remained. The true test lay ahead. Sophie knew the real work had only just begun. Under Sophie's leadership, the company was starting to shift its culture. She had carefully selected new managers and trained them rigorously on customer service, ethics, and responsibility. Gone were the days of favoritism and neglect. Sophie demanded excellence, not just in numbers, but in how the company treated its employees and clients alike. The rebuilding process wasn't without its challenges. Sophie had to make difficult decisions, including letting go of staff who were unwilling or unable to adapt to the new standards. Those who had been complicit in the old ways of doing things were replaced by individuals who shared Sophie's vision for the company's future. But even with these significant changes, there were still those who held on to the past. Sophie knew that no matter how many steps she took to clean house, it was impossible to erase the scars that had been left by years of corruption. The deeper the roots of the system, the harder it was to pull it all out. One of the hardest moments came when Sophie had to confront the ghosts of the past, those who had been caught up in the old ways of the company, and those who had been let go because of their corrupt actions. They were still out there, lingering, and Sophie was faced with the painful reality that not all battles were won with the firing of a few key people. The battle for the company's soul was a long and winding road. Sophie sat in the meeting room one afternoon, staring at a handful of former senior employees who had been let go during the company's restructuring. These were the people who had been a part of the company's corruption, those who had misused their power and created an environment that had hurt both the employees and the guests. They had become symbols of everything that had gone wrong. "I know this is difficult for all of you," Sophie began, her voice steady but somber. "But the fact remains that the culture we had here before was toxic. I didn't want to fire anyone, but I had no choice. We had to start fresh. And now, I am asking you to help us do better." One of the former managers, a woman named Linda, crossed her arms defensively. "You think you've fixed everything, Sophie, but you haven't. You've cleaned house, but the system is still broken. People like Richard don't just disappear. They find ways to keep pulling the strings, even from the outside." Sophie looked at Linda, her eyes narrowing. "I don't believe Richard will have the same influence anymore. He's no longer part of the company, and I will make sure that no one else can manipulate the system the way he did." Linda scoffed. "You're naive if you think this will be enough. There are still people inside this company who are loyal to him, and they'll work against you, Sophie. I've seen it happen before." Sophie's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. She had already suspected that there were still remnants of the old guard left behind, people who were unhappy with the changes she was implementing. But she wasn't going to let their resistance stop her. I understand the concerns, but I won't back down. This company is moving forward, and I'm going to make sure it stays on track. Anyone who tries to sabotage that will be dealt with accordingly. Linda's eyes flickered with something that could have been fear, or perhaps it was simply anger. I hope you're right, but don't expect it to be easy. You've made powerful enemies, and they won't just let you change everything without a fight. Sophie didn't respond. She didn't need to. Linda had made her point clear. The battle wasn't over yet. There would be more challenges ahead, challenges from within the company, from those who felt threatened by the changes she was bringing. But Sophie was ready. She had faced Richard, and she had faced down a system that had worked against her for far too long. She could face whatever came next. As the days passed, Sophie began to notice the subtle signs of resistance. A few employees, once loyal to the old system, began to whisper in the hallways. Small acts of defiance, like slow responses to new policies or a reluctance to participate in training, began to crop up. Sophie could feel the shift in the air. These were not the same employees who had embraced the changes with open arms. These were the ones who were still clinging to the old ways. It was clear that Sophie wasn't going to win everyone over. Some people would never accept the new company culture, no matter how hard she tried. Then came the final twist. One morning, Sophie received an anonymous tip from one of the employees still within the company. The message was short and to the point. They're planning something. They're not done. Watch your back. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Her instincts told her it wasn't over yet. The warning could have been just a rumor, but it had enough weight to make her pause. She immediately called Emily and Danny in for a meeting, determined to get to the bottom of it. She needed to know what was going on and whether or not she could trust the system she had worked so hard to build. I don't want to jump to conclusions, Sophie said as they sat together in her office. But I need to know if there's any truth to this. Are people still trying to undermine the changes? Emily, who had been by Sophie's side throughout the ordeal, looked troubled. There's been some tension. I've overheard things. Some employees are upset with the direction the company's going, and they're not happy about the training. They're looking for ways to sabotage it. Sophie's mind raced. She couldn't afford to let the company backslide. Not now. Not after everything she had fought for. She wasn't just dealing with a few rogue employees. This was bigger. She was up against a deeply ingrained culture of resistance, and it was going to take everything she had to root it out. I'll handle it, Sophie said, her voice firm. We'll find out who's behind it, and we'll deal with it. But make no mistake, this fight isn't over. The battle to change this company, it's a long road. But I'm not giving up. As Sophie looked out the window of her office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was just at the beginning of a much bigger fight. The company had been changed, but the system that had caused so much damage was still alive, lurking in the corners, waiting to strike again, and Sophie would be ready. As Sophie's journey unfolds, we learn that leadership isn't just about making tough decisions, it's about confronting uncomfortable truths and creating real change from within. The power to change a broken system comes from the courage to stand up, speak the truth, and take responsibility for the future. The question is, how far are we willing to go to make things right? If you found this story inspiring, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay tuned for more incredible stories like this, right here on Undercover Truths. Thank you for your continued support.